Elijah did not invite her inside at first, but he did not send her away either, and in the mountains that counted as something close to kindness. The fire burned low and steady, casting long amber shadows across the snow while the temperature slipped toward 20 degrees and falling. Clara rubbed her gloved hands together and watched him move with the careful economy of a man who measured every step. He added another split log to the flames, then finally nodded toward the cabin door. Inside, the air carried the scent of pine resin and iron cookware. The room was no larger than 200 square feet, built from hand-cut timber and sealed with mud and patience. A narrow bed stood against one wall, a small table near the hearth, and above it hung a single shelf lined with tin cups polished from years of use. 2 plates rested on the table already, though he had expected no visitor. Clara noticed that detail, but said nothing. She removed her coat and draped it over the back of the second chair, the one that faced the empty space across the table. Elijah poured water from a kettle that had been warming by the fire and handed her a cup without looking directly at her. Steam rose between them like a thin curtain. She thanked him in a voice that carried no fear. Outside, wind pressed against the cabin walls, rattling them in low warning. 20 miles down the mountain, the town lights would be flickering in saloons and kitchens, but up here there was only the steady pulse of flame and the sound of breathing. Clara traced a finger along the edge of the table. The wood bore faint knife marks, lines carved absent-mindedly over time. "My father used to pray before supper," she said quietly, "even if he was alone." Elijah's hand paused above the kettle. He set it down carefully. "Most men stop talking to God when no one is listening," he replied at last, his voice rough from disuse rather than anger. Clara met his eyes. He said someone is always listening. The words lingered in the cabin like smoke. Elijah turned toward the window, where frost crept along the glass in delicate patterns. He remembered a small white church with a crooked bell tower, remembered standing near the back pew while a man with steady hands spoke about mercy as if it were something you could hold. He had not stepped inside that building in 15 years. Clara took a slow sip from her cup. "He told me about a friend who moved to the mountains," she continued. "A man who thought silence could quiet regret." Elijah's shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly. The fire snapped, sending a brief shower of sparks up the chimney. He pulled out the second chair and set it squarely across from his own, the legs scraping softly against the plank floor. He did not explain the gesture. He did not have to. The mountains outside stood cold and immense, but inside that small cabin, the air had shifted. The past, which he had buried beneath snow and distance, had begun to thaw. The cabin felt smaller as the night settled deeper into the mountains, the kind of darkness that swallowed sound and left only the steady rhythm of breath and flame. Elijah remained seated, his broad hands resting on the table as if the wood itself could anchor him. Clara did not press him with questions. She understood that some truths came like winter thaw, slow and unwilling. Outside, the wind eased, and the forest grew still, the pines standing like tall sentinels beneath a sky thick with stars. It had been 15 years since Elijah Boone had heard the name Whitmore spoken above a whisper. He remembered the first time he had met the preacher, a spring morning in town when mud clung to boots and hope clung to men who believed land disputes could be settled with handshakes instead of pride. The preacher had been younger then, not yet streaked with gray, carrying a worn Bible and a way of looking at men that made them feel seen rather than judged. Elijah had stood outside the church door that day, uncertain whether to step in. The preacher had noticed him anyway. "A man does not have to kneel to be forgiven," he had said once, voice calm as still water. "But he does have to remember." Elijah had remembered. That was the trouble. Clara leaned forward slightly, the firelight catching strands of her hair. "He told me you were stubborn," she said softly, not with accusation, but with familiarity. "Said you thought leaving town would fix what staying could not." Elijah let out a breath that fogged faintly in the cool cabin air. "Your father talked too much," he replied, though there was no heat in the words. Clara's lips curved into the smallest hint of a smile. "He talked when others would not." Silence stretched again, but it was no longer sharp. It carried weight instead of tension. Elijah reached beneath the table and drew out a small wooden box, its surface scratched by years of handling. He set it down carefully between them. He did not open it. He only rested his palm on the lid, as if the grain beneath his fingers held a pulse. "The last time I saw him," Elijah said slowly, choosing each word as though it might crack if handled roughly. "He was standing between men who believed they were right." He did not describe what followed. He did not need to. Clara lowered her gaze, absorbing what was left unsaid. She had grown up with stories about courage, about peacemakers who carried no weapon except conviction. She had also grown up with absence. "He never blamed you," she said at last. The statement hung in the air like a lantern lifted into darkness. Elijah's eyes closed briefly, the lines at their corners deepening. For years he had carried the belief that distance was penance, that solitude was payment. He had built walls of timber and silence, thinking they would shield others from the memory of that day. But now, sitting across from the preacher's daughter, he understood that memory had climbed the mountain anyway. The second chair remained between them, no longer empty in spirit, and the fire burned steady, as if waiting for the next truth to be spoken. The wooden box remained between them, small and unassuming, yet heavier than anything else in the room. Elijah kept his hand resting on it, as though removing it would allow the past to spill out uncontrolled. The fire had settled into a deep orange glow, casting steady light against the cabin walls, and the temperature outside had fallen below 15 degrees, cold enough that the window glass carried a thin rim of ice along its edges. Clara sat quietly, her back straight, her eyes patient. She had not climbed 3 miles in winter darkness for half-truths. Elijah finally lifted the lid. Inside lay a folded piece of paper, brittle with age, and beneath it a simple brass watch, its chain dulled by time. He did not touch the watch at first. "Your father left this with me," he said, voice low, almost steady. Clara leaned forward slightly, recognizing the watch before he even lifted it. She had seen it in childhood, tucked into her father's vest pocket each Sunday morning. Elijah placed it carefully on the table between them. The ticking had long since stopped, but in the quiet cabin it seemed as though the silence itself carried rhythm. "He asked me to keep it until I learned the difference between guilt and responsibility," Elijah continued. The words came slowly, not as confession, but as understanding earned the hard way. Clara's fingers hovered above the watch, but did not close around it. "And did you?" she asked. Elijah looked toward the fire, watching the flames curl around the logs he had cut that morning. For years he had believed that leaving town had been his burden to carry, that isolation was a kind of payment. He had refused invitations, refused letters, refused the chance to sit again in a wooden pew beneath a crooked bell. He had thought that was what honor demanded. "I thought walking away meant I was taking the blame," he said at last. "But blame is not the same as keeping a promise." Clara studied him carefully. "What promise?" Elijah lifted the folded paper from the box and placed it beside the watch. He did not unfold it yet. "He told me not to let the town grow harder because of what happened," Elijah said. "He said men follow silence. If I hid, others would choose sides instead of peace." The wind brushed softly against the cabin walls, no longer a warning but a reminder of how small a single dwelling was against the mountain. Clara lowered her gaze to the paper. "You left," she said gently. It was not accusation. It was fact. Elijah nodded once. "I left because I believed my presence divided them," he replied. "I did not realize my absence might do worse." The fire shifted, sending light across Clara's face, and for a moment she looked less like a young woman seeking medicine and more like the steady voice her father had once carried. "He never wanted you to disappear," she said quietly. Elijah finally unfolded the paper, revealing careful handwriting faded but legible. He did not read it aloud. He did not need to. The message had lived in him for years. The second chair by the table no longer represented someone lost beyond reach. It represented a promise unfinished, waiting not for solitude, but for courage of a different kind. Elijah held the unfolded letter above the firelight, not to burn it, but to see it clearly, as though the flames could restore what time had faded. The handwriting slanted firm and deliberate, each stroke steady, each word spaced with the patience of a man who believed meaning deserved room. Clara watched his face rather than the page. She saw the shift there first, the subtle change that comes when memory stops resisting and begins to speak. Outside, the wind moved down the ridge in a low, steady current, brushing snow from the roof in soft whispers. The mountain felt less like a fortress and more like a witness. Elijah lowered the letter slowly. He wrote this the night before he rode out to settle that dispute. He said, voice quieter now, not from fear, but from something older. He told me that men who stand in the middle often carry the blame from both sides. Clara nodded once. She had heard similar words as a child, though never the full weight behind them. Elijah continued. He said if anything happened, I was not to bury myself in shame. I was to stay, to help mend what pride had torn. The words seemed to linger between them, heavier than the wooden beams overhead. For 15 years, Elijah had done the opposite. He had retreated to this cabin, carved out of timber and isolation, believing distance was honorable. He had measured winters in cords of firewood and silence, telling himself that staying away kept old wounds from reopening. Clara reached forward and gently lifted the brass watch. The chain glinted softly in the firelight. He believed in you, she said, her voice carrying no doubt. Elijah looked at the watch as if it were a compass he had refused to read. Belief is easier to accept when a man thinks he deserves it, he replied. Clara met his eyes without flinching. Deserving is not always the point. The cabin fell quiet again, but the silence no longer pressed down on Elijah's shoulders. It felt different, less like punishment and more like space waiting to be filled. He rose from his chair and walked to the small window. The night sky stretched clear and sharp above the pines, stars scattered like frost across black stone. 20 miles below, the town lay unaware that its missing mountain man stood at a threshold he had avoided for over a decade. The town thinks I ran because I was afraid, Elijah said slowly. Maybe I let them think that. Clara stood beside him now, her reflection faint in the glass. And what do you think? She asked. Elijah took a long breath, the kind a man draws before stepping into cold water. I think I was afraid of staying, he admitted. The confession did not shake him. It steadied him. The second chair by the table no longer symbolized loss alone. It symbolized unfinished duty. Clara placed the watch back into the wooden box, but left the letter outside of it, resting open on the table. My mother is ill, she said gently. The town is divided again. They still argue about land and pride. They still need someone who remembers what he taught. Elijah turned from the window. The fire behind him cast a taller shadow than before, stretching across the floor toward the door. For the first time in 15 years, the path down the mountain did not feel like exile. It felt like return. Elijah did not answer Clara right away. Instead, he moved with deliberate calm, crossing the small cabin to the peg near the door where his heavy coat hung. The leather had stiffened with years of snow and sun, the shoulders creased from long rides that had once carried him toward town instead of away from it. He lifted it down and ran a hand along the sleeve as if reacquainting himself with an older version of the man who had worn it. The fire behind him burned steady, no longer casting restless shadows but a clear, unwavering light. Clara remained near the table, watching without pressing him, understanding that a decision like this did not need encouragement. It needed room. Outside, the wind had settled into a low murmur across the ridge, and the night sky stretched wide and sharp above the trees. The temperature hovered near 10 degrees, cold enough that breath turned instantly to silver in the air. Elijah stepped out onto the porch for a moment, boots crunching against packed snow, and looked down the narrow trail that cut through the pines. It wound for miles, dropping nearly 2,000 feet toward the valley where lanterns would be glowing in kitchen windows. For 15 winters that path had meant departure. Now it meant something else. He felt the weight of the folded letter still in his pocket, close to his chest, not as a burden, but as a compass. Clara joined him outside, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders. It will be harder now, she said quietly. Elijah nodded once. It should be, he replied. Easy roads do not mend anything. They stood in silence, listening to the mountain breathe. Somewhere in the distance, a branch shifted beneath snow. The world felt vast, yet the decision before him felt simple in its truth. He turned back inside and began to move with purpose. He packed a small canvas satchel with dried meat, a tin cup, and the wooden box containing the watch. He left the second chair where it stood. He did not carry it to the door, did not dismantle the ritual he had kept for so long. Instead, he set the chair squarely facing the hearth one last time and adjusted it so that it stood firm and balanced. You are not closing this place, Clara observed softly. Elijah shook his head. No, he said. I am done hiding in it. The words did not carry defiance. They carried resolve. He extinguished the lantern by the bedside but left the fire burning low, contained within stone. At dawn it would fade on its own. He slung the satchel over his shoulder and stepped back into the night air, the cold biting sharp against his face. The mountain did not protest his leaving. It simply watched. Clara fell into step beside him as they began the long descent. Snow crunched beneath their boots, steady and certain. With each step downward, the distance between past and present narrowed. Elijah Boone did not walk like a man fleeing memory. He walked like a man finally ready to stand where he once should have remained. They began the descent before midnight, boots pressing careful tracks into the narrow trail that cut through pine and stone, the moon casting a pale silver path across the snow. The mountain air felt sharper as they moved lower, thinner at the ridge but growing steadier with each mile. Elijah walked a step ahead, not out of distance but out of habit, scanning the slope, testing each foothold before committing his weight. Clara followed close, matching his pace without complaint, her breath steady despite the cold. The trail dropped nearly 2,000 feet over the next 4 miles, winding past frozen streams and dark clusters of fir trees that stood shoulder to shoulder like silent witnesses. For years Elijah had taken this path only in memory, tracing it in his mind while telling himself that time would eventually make return unnecessary. Now each step carried the quiet reckoning of a man who understood that time did not erase unfinished promises. They paused once near a bend where the valley finally came into view. Below them, scattered lantern lights flickered against the darkness, small but unmistakable. The town lay quiet at this hour, wooden rooftops dusted with snow, smoke rising faintly from chimneys into the cold sky. Clara stood beside him, her eyes fixed on the same lights. "They still argue," she said softly. "Land boundaries, grazing rights, old grudges." Elijah nodded slowly. "Grudges grow in silence," he replied. The words carried no bitterness, only observation. He remembered how quickly men had taken sides years ago, how easily pride had spoken louder than patience. He had told himself that leaving removed one cause of division. He had not considered that absence could become its own rumor. The wind shifted slightly, brushing across the valley and carrying with it the faint scent of wood smoke and distant livestock. It felt different from the mountain air, heavier, human. Elijah adjusted the strap of his satchel across his shoulder and began walking again. As they reached the lower stretch of the trail, the snow thinned, replaced by patches of frozen earth and wagon ruts hardened by winter. The town's outline grew clearer, the church steeple still leaning slightly to one side, the general store porch sagging under age, the row of hitching posts standing like quiet sentries along Main Street. 15 years had passed, yet much remained the same. Clara slowed slightly as they approached the outskirts, where the first fences marked private land. "They will see you," she said. Elijah did not hesitate. "That is the point," he answered. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of years spent in retreat. He did not draw his coat tighter against the cold. He let the night air touch his face fully, as if to prove he no longer needed shelter from what awaited. Ahead, a dog barked once in the distance, then fell silent. A lantern flickered in an upstairs window. The town was sleeping, unaware that a man long considered gone was walking back into its story. Elijah Boone did not quicken his pace. He did not slow it either. He walked straight toward the first wooden building at the edge of town, steady and unhidden, the crunch of his boots against frozen ground sounding clear in the quiet night. The first boardwalk creaked under Elijah's weight as he stepped onto Main Street, the sound sharp in the stillness of early morning. It was just before dawn, that thin hour when night loosens its grip, but the sun has not yet claimed the sky. Frost clung to the hitching posts, and a thin layer of ice glazed the water trough near the general store. Clara walked beside him, her shoulders squared despite the long descent, her gaze steady on the narrow stretch of street ahead. The town looked smaller than it had in Elijah's memory, the buildings no taller than 2 stories, their paint worn by wind and sun. Yet the place carried a presence that felt heavier than the mountain he had just left. A lantern flickered inside the bakery at the corner, and through the window, he could see old Mr. Halpern kneading dough with slow, practiced motions. The baker looked up as if sensing movement and froze when he recognized the figure standing beneath the pale wash of dawn. His hand stopped mid-motion. Elijah did not wave. He did not lower his eyes. He simply stood there, visible. A door opened across the street, and a ranch hand stepped out, collar turned high against the cold. The man paused, squinting into the gray light, then stiffened. Word did not need to be spoken. Recognition traveled faster than any greeting. Clara felt it too, the shift in the air as awareness spread from window to window. Curtains moved slightly. A second lantern flared to life upstairs in the boarding house. Elijah's boots left clear prints in the thin frost as he crossed toward the church at the end of the street. The steeple leaned the same few inches it always had, the white paint peeling along the edges. He stopped at the bottom of the wooden steps. For a moment, he simply looked at the door, remembering the last time he had stood there with dust on his boots and doubt in his chest. Clara moved ahead of him and placed her hand gently against the church door, pushing it open. The hinges gave a soft, tired groan. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old wood and candle wax. Light filtered through narrow windows, casting pale bands across the pews. Elijah stepped in slowly, removing his hat without ceremony. The room was empty, yet it did not feel abandoned. Footsteps sounded behind them on the boardwalk outside, then another set, then another. The town was waking fully now, not with shouts, not with accusation, but with the quiet gravity of people drawn towards something unfinished. Elijah walked down the center aisle and stopped midway, resting his hand briefly on the back of a pew worn smooth by years of prayer. Clara stood near the front, turning to face the doorway as figures began to gather there, filling the threshold in silence. No one spoke his name. They did not need to. He had returned, not with explanation prepared or defense ready, but simply present. The morning light grew stronger, slipping through the windows and laying itself across his shoulders as if marking the place where he now stood. The church doorway filled slowly, not with accusation, but with the weight of years that had never been spoken aloud. Men who had once stood shoulder to shoulder now lingered a few feet apart, hats in hand, eyes cautious but curious. Women gathered near the back pews, whispering softly, their glances shifting between Elijah and Clara as if measuring what this return meant. Morning light poured through the tall, narrow windows, stretching across the wooden floor in pale gold bands that carried the faint dust of long, quiet Sundays. Elijah remained where he stood midway down the aisle, hat lowered at his side, posture straight but unguarded. He did not move toward the pulpit. He did not claim a place of authority. He stood as a man among neighbors, not above them. A rancher near the doorway cleared his throat, the sound echoing more loudly than intended in the still room. "We thought you were gone for good," he said finally, his voice carrying neither warmth nor hostility, only fact. Elijah turned his head slightly, meeting the man's gaze without challenge. "I thought so too," he replied. The simplicity of the answer left no room for argument. Another voice rose from the left pew, older, edged with memory. "You left after that day," the man said. He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. The day hung in the air like smoke that never quite cleared. Clara stepped forward then, moving to stand beside Elijah rather than behind him. She did not speak immediately. She let the silence breathe. It was the same silence that had divided them once before. Elijah reached into his coat and withdrew the folded letter. The paper looked small against his broad hand. He did not wave it for attention. He simply held it where it could be seen. "He asked me to stay," Elijah said, his voice steady and clear enough to reach the back of the church. "I did not." A murmur shifted through the room, not sharp, not condemning, just the sound of people adjusting old assumptions. Elijah continued, "I believed leaving would keep the peace. I was wrong." He let the words rest. There was no defense attached to them, no explanation wrapped around them like a shield. Only acknowledgement. The rancher near the door shifted his weight. "And now?" he asked quietly. Elijah glanced once at Clara, then back at the gathered faces. "Now I am here," he said. The statement carried more weight than any promise. Outside, the first full rays of sun struck the church steeple, lighting the weathered white paint in a soft glow. The town had gathered expecting argument or justification. Instead, they found a man who did not hide behind either. Clara lifted her chin slightly and addressed them all. "My father believed that standing together required someone willing to remain when it would be easier to walk away," she said. The words did not accuse. They invited. The silence that followed was no longer strained. It felt like ground being tested before the first step forward. Elijah did not ask for forgiveness. He did not demand trust. He simply remained in the aisle, present and unmoving, allowing the town to decide whether his return would divide them once more or finally draw them back toward the promise that had once held them together. The silence inside the church did not break all at once. It shifted slowly, like snow sliding from a roof when the sun finally touches it. A chair leg scraped softly against the wooden floor near the back pew as someone adjusted their stance. A cough followed, then the creak of boots turning. The town had expected argument, perhaps even pride dressed as apology. Instead, they found neither. Elijah remained steady in the aisle, the folded letter still visible in his hand, not raised like evidence, but held like a reminder. An older rancher named Thomas Avery stepped forward from the doorway, his hair more gray than brown now, his shoulders bent slightly from years of work. 15 years ago, he had stood on one side of that land dispute, certain of his claim, certain of his rightness. Now he removed his hat fully and spoke in a voice roughened by age rather than anger. "We were all certain back then," he said slowly. "Certain enough to forget why we built this town together in the first place." His words settled over the room with more weight than accusation ever could. A younger man near the front shifted uneasily. "The boundary lines are still not settled," he said, not confrontational, only honest. "Families still argue over where fences should stand." Elijah listened without interruption. He did not step toward the pulpit. He did not raise his voice. "Then settle them," he said calmly. Not with pride, with patience. The simplicity of it made several men glance at one another. It sounded almost too plain. Clara moved forward another step, her presence steady but unobtrusive. "My father believed land could be measured," she said, "but character could not. He believed this town would last only if men cared more about staying neighbors than winning arguments." The morning light brightened further, illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily above the pews. Outside, more townsfolk gathered along the boardwalk, peering through the open door, drawn not by spectacle but by something quieter. Thomas Avery nodded once, as if conceding not defeat but perspective. "We let that day define us," he admitted. "We let it split us." Elijah folded the letter carefully and returned it to his coat pocket. "I let it define me too," he said. "That is why I left." The admission did not diminish him. It steadied him. A woman near the aisle, her hands clasped tightly at her waist, spoke up with a tremor in her voice. "And now?" she asked. Elijah looked around the room, meeting eyes one by one. "Now we decide if we are stronger together than we were divided," he replied. He did not say more. He did not offer guarantees. The church bell above them shifted faintly in the breeze, producing a soft, hollow note that echoed once and faded. It felt less like an alarm and more like a call. One by one, men who had stood apart began to step closer, not fully reconciled, not suddenly changed, but willing. The distance between pews narrowed as bodies filled the spaces. No signatures were written, no formal declarations made. Yet something had begun to mend. Elijah Boone did not claim credit. He simply remained where he stood, present in the center aisle, no longer a memory that divided the town, but a man who had chosen to stand within it once again. The gathering did not dissolve when the first words were spoken. It deepened. Men who had once measured distance in acres now measured it in steps, closing the space between pews without being asked. The morning had fully broken outside, sunlight spilling across Main Street and creeping through the church windows in bright, steady beams. Dust glowed in the light like quiet witnesses suspended in air. Elijah stood where he had been, not at the front, not at the back, but in the middle, the place his friend had once chosen when others argued from opposite sides. Thomas Avery cleared his throat again, this time not from uncertainty, but resolve. "We have a survey map in the town hall," he said. "It has not been unrolled in years." A younger rancher nodded slowly. "We could bring it here," he offered. The suggestion carried no challenge, only willingness. Clara watched the exchange with calm attention. She saw something shifting that no speech alone could command. It was not agreement yet. It was openness. Elijah finally moved, stepping aside from the aisle and taking a seat halfway down a pew, not claiming the center but relinquishing it. The gesture did not go unnoticed. He was not there to lead from a pulpit. He was there to remain. Several men exited briefly and returned carrying a long wooden tube that held the old survey map. They laid it across the front pew and carefully unrolled it. The paper crackled softly, edges worn but intact. Lines drawn years ago stretched across the page in ink that had faded but endured. The boundary markers looked smaller now than the grudges they had inspired. Thomas placed a steady hand on one corner of the map. "We argued over this line," he said quietly, tracing a thin mark with his finger. "But we never argued about the well here." He pointed to a small circle near the center. A murmur passed through the room as others leaned closer. The well served every family during drought seasons. No one had claimed it solely. It had always belonged to all. Clara stepped nearer, her voice gentle but clear. "My father used to say that shared water mattered more than fenced land," she said. The memory hung in the air without bitterness. Elijah remained seated, watching not the map but the faces bent over it. He saw something he had not seen in years, neighbors leaning toward one another instead of away. A younger farmer spoke carefully. "If we redraw the fence by 50 yards, both herds can graze without crossing," he suggested. The idea was practical, modest. It did not demand victory. It offered balance. Thomas nodded slowly. 50 yards is less than the distance we have kept between families for too long." The statement drew a few quiet breaths of agreement. Outside, the church bell shifted gently in the breeze again, its tone soft and unhurried. No one rang it. It moved on its own. Elijah felt the weight in his chest lighten, not because conflict had vanished, but because pride had loosened its grip. He had once believed absence could heal what tension strained. Now he watched presence do what distance never could. No hands were shaken dramatically. No cheers rose. Instead, pens were fetched, measurements reconsidered, and lines discussed with care rather than accusation. Elijah Boone did not stand to claim the change. He remained seated among them, hat resting on his knee, content to let the town mend itself in the very place where it had once begun to fracture. By late morning the map no longer lay flat and untouched, but bore new pencil marks drawn with cautious hands. The lines had not been erased entirely, only adjusted, shifted by inches here and yards there, enough to make room where there had once been none. Sunlight filled the church, fully now, warming the wooden pews and chasing the last chill from the floorboards. The air felt different, lighter, as though the building itself had been holding its breath for years. Men who had once avoided standing too near one another now leaned shoulder to shoulder over the map, speaking in low, practical tones about fence posts, shared grazing schedules, and the coming spring thaw. No one raised a voice. No one claimed triumph. It was work, simple and necessary, done without spectacle. Elijah remained seated until Thomas Avery turned and met his eyes. There was no accusation there anymore, only acknowledgement. "You going to stay this time?" Thomas asked quietly. The question carried no pressure, only hope. Elijah rose slowly, placing his hat back on his head but not pulling it low. "Yes," he answered. The single word settled into the room with steady weight. Clara stood near the front window, watching the street outside where townsfolk had begun to gather in small groups, speaking in measured tones rather than sharp ones. The news of redrawn lines had traveled faster than rumor once had. She turned back toward Elijah, her expression calm but resolute. "My mother will need help through the winter," she said softly. Elijah nodded. "Then I will help," he replied without hesitation. It was not a grand promise. It was an ordinary one. And ordinary promises, kept consistently, had always built stronger towns than dramatic gestures ever could. A few of the younger men began rolling the survey map carefully back into its tube, treating it not as a battleground but as a tool. Thomas extended his hand toward Elijah, not as a formal reconciliation, but as neighbor to neighbor. Elijah accepted it with a firm, steady grip. The handshake lasted only a moment, yet it closed a distance that had stretched 15 years. Outside, the church bell moved again in the mild breeze, its tone softer now, almost content. Clara stepped beside Elijah as they exited onto the boardwalk. The frost had melted into damp wood beneath the warming sun. Across the street, Mr. Halpern from the bakery gave a brief nod before returning to his work. No applause greeted Elijah. No crowd surrounded him. Instead, there were simple gestures, a lifted hand, a quiet greeting, space made rather than withheld. The town did not need a hero. It needed someone willing to remain present. when staying felt harder than leaving. Elijah looked once toward the distant ridge where his cabin stood unseen beyond the pines. He did not feel torn. The mountain had given him solitude. The town now required his steadiness. And for the first time in many winters, the path before him did not feel like exile or escape. It felt like belonging earned not by pride, but by return. Winter did not loosen its hold all at once, but by late afternoon the sun had softened the frost along Main Street and turned the hard ground to damp earth beneath steady boots. Elijah spent the rest of that day not in the church, not in the center of any gathering, but beside Thomas Avery and two younger ranchers walking the disputed boundary on foot. They measured the 50 yards with a length of rope and quiet agreement, marking new fence posts where old pride had once stood immovable. No speeches were given. No one mentioned the past again. Work replaced memory, and in that exchange something deeper than apology settled into place. Clara returned home briefly to check on her mother, and when she stepped back onto the porch, she found Elijah already stacking split wood along the side of the house without being asked. He worked with the same steady rhythm he had used in the mountains, each log placed carefully, not rushed, not performed. Her mother watched from the window, recognizing him not as the man who left, but as the man who had come back. Days turned into weeks, and Elijah did not retreat to the ridge. He helped mend fences, shared coffee at dawn with neighbors who once avoided his gaze, and sat in the same pew each Sunday without seeking attention. The town adjusted not because of grand declarations, but because presence became habit. When spring finally touched the valley, melting the last patches of snow and filling the shared well to its brim, the boundary lines held firm without argument. Children ran across open grass where men had once argued over inches. One evening, as the sky turned amber and the air carried the scent of thawed earth, Elijah walked alone to the edge of town where the trail began its long climb back toward the mountains. He did not take it. He only stood there, hat in hand, looking at the distant ridge softened. By dusk, he remembered the second chair beside his cabin hearth, the ritual he had kept for years to honor someone lost. Then he turned and walked back toward the cluster of homes lit by warm lantern glow. That night, in the small room he now rented above the general store, he placed a simple wooden chair near the window before sitting down to supper. It faced the room, not empty in sorrow, but open in welcome. The brass watch rested on the table beside him, its ticking still silent, yet no longer heavy. Outside, the church bell moved gently in the evening breeze, its tone low and steady. No one rang it. It did not need to be wrong. The town no longer stood divided by absence. It stood steadied by a man who had chosen to remain. And in that quiet decision, without spectacle and without force, the promise once spoken in a small white church finally found its shape. Out here, redemption did not arrive with noise. It arrived with a man brave enough to come back and stay.